Yo, what is up guys? Delboy here, aka Blue Collar Sports TV. Hopefully you guys are doing well. If you're new here, smash that like, hit subscribe, all of that good stuff. So this video is a quick preview and prediction for Chris Eubank Jr. versus Liam Williams. This fight goes down on the 5th of February, takes place at the Motorpoint Arena in Cardiff, and it will be televised by Sky Sports. And I have to say, I really like this fight. This is an excellent domestic matchup, and even better, it's not on pay-per-view, it's on regular Sky Sports. So I'm all on board with this fight. I'm very excited by it, and it's a great look by Boxer to put on this sort of fight so quickly into their tenure with Sky Sports. Of course, Boxer have taken over from Matchroom on Sky Sports, and I think this is a really good event. I mean, when you look at Sky Sports in recent years, when it comes to their regular shows, not pay-per-view, this is one of the strongest domestic matchups in recent years on Sky Sports. So I think this is a good look for Boxer, and all in all, I think they've started their tenure on Sky Sports pretty well. Obviously, they made Brook versus Khan. I know that fight is way too late, but the fact they made that fight so quickly is definitely impressive. They've signed a couple of interesting prospects like Fraser Clark, the Olympian, the heavyweight medalist. So yeah, Boxer right now is looking quite interesting, and this in my opinion is a really good fight. So yeah, let's briefly break down the tale of the tape, and we shall start with Chris Eubank Jr., who goes in as the favourite. Chris Eubank Jr. has a record of 31 wins, 2 defeats, and 23 of those 31 wins coming by way of KO, whereas Liam Williams has a record of 23 wins, 3 defeats, 1 draw, 18 of his 23 wins coming by way of knockout. Chris Eubank Jr. is listed as 5'11" with a 72.5 inch reach, whereas Liam Williams is listed as 5'10" with a 70 inch reach. So Chris Eubank Jr. is slightly the bigger man. He's got a 1 inch height advantage and a 2.5 inch reach advantage. So yeah, Chris Eubank Jr. is slightly bigger. Both guys are orthodox fighters, and Chris Eubank Jr. is 32 years old, whereas Liam Williams is 29 years old. So both guys are in and around their prime years, and also both guys are orthodox fighters. So now the tale of the tape is out of the way, let's briefly break down the matchup, what I believe each guy should do to stand the best chance of winning, and eventually at the end of the video I will make my official pick. I guess we shall start with Chris Eubank Jr. Of course, in the last 18 months or so, Chris Eubank Jr. has joined up with Roy Jones Jr. and Roy Jones is now Chris Eubank's new trainer. He's had a couple of fights under Roy Jones, and those 2 fights I've seen from Eubank Jr. under Roy Jones, it looked like Chris Eubank Jr. was trying to implement new techniques in those fights which he's learned from Roy Jones Jr. And honestly, he didn't look too convincing doing it. I know he was fighting lesser competition, so he could afford to do it, but I don't think he can afford to go into this fight with Liam Williams under that sort of mindset. Liam Williams, in my opinion, is a bit too good, a bit too dangerous to be trying out new techniques and honing your skills kind of thing. I think Chris Eubank Jr. under Roy Jones Jr., he's looking to be a much more cerebral fighter, less punch output and more economical with his work, relying more on accuracy, staying out of range and landing single counter punches. And against a guy like Liam Williams, who does maintain a good work rate, he's got no reverse gear, that could lead into Chris Eubank Jr. potentially being outworked in rounds. In this fight, I want to see Eubank Jr. try and mesh this newer style with his older style. I think there's got to be times in this fight where Eubank Jr. meets Liam Williams head on and throws his combination punches, because Eubank Jr. has certain shots that can definitely pose problems for Liam Williams. One thing about Liam Williams that we have seen in the Liam Smith fights, and especially against Demetrius Andrade, he's open for an uppercut on either side, with whether it be the left hand or the right hand. And as we know, Chris Eubank Jr. has very good uppercuts. Liam Williams is a pressure fighter, and he'll come forwards, and he comes forwards in like a hunch. So his head is not over his front foot, but his head is leaning forwards, and he doesn't really take his head off centre line. So Liam Williams is definitely open for the uppercut. So I'd like to see Chris Eubank Jr. Obviously snipe from the outside with that jab, but touch, try and draw Liam Williams in, half step back, and then come up with the uppercut, and then throw combinations off the initial uppercut. Try and basically fight in bursts, get your work done, and then reset, make Liam Williams chase you. In this fight, I don't really want to see Eubank Jr. try to box behind that jab, flick the jab, and land single shots. I think he needs to mix it up in this fight and fight with a slightly higher punch output than he's done in his previous 2 fights under Roy Jones Jr. Because in his last 2 fights, man, there's been long periods of time where he's not really throwing any punches with any mean intentions. And yeah, going into a fight with Liam Williams, I don't think that's necessarily a good idea. Also in this fight, I'd like to see Eubank Jr. actually try to sustain a body attack on Liam Williams. Again, Williams is the guy who in my opinion, is going to apply pressure in this fight. So to slow those legs down, I'd like to see Eubank Jr. try to work that body. Eubank Jr. has got a nice left hook to the body when he uses it, but sometimes he's guilty of headhunting. But he can definitely go to the body when he wants to. So that's another avenue of success, in my opinion, for Chris Eubank Jr. Because obviously the body shots can slow the aggressor down. They can slow his foot movement down. They can reduce his punch output and punch power when you drain a guy to the body. And also I think Liam Williams is a guy who can be not intimidated, that's the wrong word, but Liam Williams can be put in his place. He's got that bully boy mentality, and, you know, against Liam Smith in particular in both fights, you know, despite what we thought of the outcomes in those fights, I think there were times, especially in that first fight, where Liam Williams was definitely starting to feel sorry for himself. Liam Smith wasn't going anywhere, and yes, that fight was ended by a foul, but Liam Williams, to me, looked too eager to get out of that fight. And I think, yeah, I think Liam Williams can definitely be put in his place. I think he's got a bully boy mentality. So, you know, Eubank needs to definitely make him feel what's coming. You know, he needs to try and connect with some good shots early on, plant that seed of doubt into Liam Williams' mind, and try to domesticate him essentially and chop him down slowly but surely. I think in this fight, Eubank, yeah, he needs to maintain range. He needs to try and stick that jab. He can do that against pressure guys. Eubank struggles to box when somebody's boxing with him, and I don't think Liam Williams is going to do that in this fight. So yeah, don't get me wrong, I'd like to see Eubank box behind the jab, step around Liam Williams, make Liam reset, but he needs to be picking his moments when to attack and when to let go of those combinations, because when Eubank opens up with those sort of 5 and 6 punch combinations against these sort of come forward pressure guys, he can really put a hurting on them. So yeah, Eubank just needs to up his work rate in this fight, be a little more aggressive, try to merge what he's doing with Roy Jones, and merge it with his old style kind of thing. But yeah, you know, still work behind that jab, look for counters, but I want to see Eubank Jr. going through the gears and really letting go of punches in bunches in stages, you know. But as for Liam Williams, I mean, in this fight, I think stylistically, I do believe he is somewhat disadvantaged going into this fight. Eubank Jr. tends to do better against come-forward pressure fighters. So Liam Williams in this fight needs to show a lot more subtleties and nuances to his game than he showed against Demetrius Andrade. In that fight, Liam Williams was basically just chasing Andrade all across the ring. He wasn't really jabbing his way in. He was trying to get close and work, and he was giving Andrade problems, but the lack of a jab in that fight definitely hindered him. So on top of Liam Williams' pressure game, I want to see Liam Williams really utilise that jab on a consistent basis. That's a shot that Eubank Jr., given his low hands, he's always struggled to contend with a good jab, and I think that would be the same even from a pressure guy. So I want to see Liam Williams extremely jab heavy in this fight. When you watched Liam Williams on the come up, he was much more of an aggressive boxer puncher, more so than just a pure pressure fighter. If you go back and watch that first Liam Smith fight, early in that fight, Liam Williams was boxing really well on the front foot. He was boxing behind the jab, setting up his right hand, going to the body, showing good variety, and I think we need to see that in this fight with Chris Eubank Jr. He needs to be a lot more cerebral. He needs to be a lot more reliant on his technique, and I think he needs to go back to that boxer puncher style, especially boxing behind that jab, and maybe try to actually engage Chris Eubank Jr. in the exchanges. Eubank Jr. has very good hand speed, as we know, when he lets go of combinations, and he tends to overwhelm guys. However, you can punch with Chris Eubank Jr. and he can be caught. If you go back and watch Eubank Jr.'s last two fights under Roy Jones Jr. against Marcus Morrison and against the German guy, both of those guys were able to time Eubank Jr. flush in between his punches on a few occasions. So I think Liam Williams in this fight, he needs to be willing to punch with Eubank Jr. and I think he needs to try and catch Eubank Jr. in those exchanges. Liam Williams does have good power. He does have decent timing, so he needs to try and stay composed and really draw Eubank Jr. into that sort of fight, and then from there try to land those telling shots in the exchanges. I think Liam Williams just coming forwards, barging forwards and trying to throw a million punches, if he does that, I don't really think it's going to end well for him, quite frankly. Yeah, he could outwork Eubank Jr. in a few rounds, but I think he'll be walking onto too many shots, and I think you could see a scenario similar to the Nick Blackwell fight, not in regards to the outcome and how badly that fight ended, but just a guy coming forwards and taking a lot of punishment. So Liam Williams in this fight needs to be a lot more cerebral, and that comes off his jab, in my opinion. Pressure behind the jab, try to engage Eubank Jr. in the exchanges, and essentially try to nail him with something big, But on the flip side, maybe he's going to do something completely opposite. He's now with Adam Booth, which is an interesting link-up, in my opinion. Maybe he's going to be more of an ambush fighter in this fight. Traditionally, Adam Booth likes a guy who is quite explosive, likes to get in and out, and really, really kind of pick his moments when to attack. Maybe Liam Williams is going to try something completely different in this fight. Who knows? Maybe he'll try and box on the back foot and take advantage of Eubank Jr.'s technical deficiencies, and maybe if Liam Williams boxes behind the jab, he could give Eubank some problems based off Liam Williams' good jab. Eubank's not great when it comes to cutting off a ring or having to take the lead, and we saw that against Billy Joe Saunders when Saunders was maintaining range, taking half a step back. Eubank Jr. really struggled in that fight, and we saw the same with George Groves. So maybe Liam Williams is going to watch those fights and try to pull off something similar, because Liam Williams can box. He can box a bit, and I think he's got enough boxing ability to actually give Eubank Jr. some problems on the back foot. However, he could do that, give Eubank problems, maybe even win 7 rounds to 5, but he's not going to get the decision. Sky Sports have a lot invested in Chris Eubank Jr., so, maybe that could work, but it might not be the best strategy. So I think Liam Williams in this fight needs to be training for the knockout, trying to catch Eubank Jr. in between his punches. But there we go. It's a good fight. But my official prediction in this bout is I'm going to go with a Eubank Jr. points win or potentially a late stoppage. I think he's going to be doing the more eye-catching work. I think when he goes through the gears, I think his work's going to be a lot more hurtful than Liam Williams, and all in all, I just believe he'll outfight Liam Williams to either a points win or maybe even a late stoppage. But Liam Williams is definitely a live dog in this fight. He's got a chance. I think this fight is quite interestingly, it's an interesting matchup in regards to the stylistic clash, and especially considering what is Eubank Jr.'s style right now. We don't really know under Roy Jones Jr. And how is Liam Williams going to change under Adam Booth? To me, that's a weird partnership. So there's a lot going into this fight that makes me very interested. And yeah, all in all, I think it's a really good domestic matchup. But I think the safe bet is Chris Eubank Jr. in this fight. Anyway, share your thoughts below on this fight. Who are you picking to win? And apologies for the lack of content in recent weeks. Obviously, with Christmas, New Year, and January's been really quiet. There's really not been much to talk about. But I'll try and get some more videos out. I do apologise for the lack of content. But yeah, January's just been a shit month, to be honest. It is what it is. Anyway, share your thoughts below. It's been your guy Delboy. Peace.